Welcome to our latest Bitcoin podcast. This week's podcast will be a replay of a speech given this week on February 17th at Iowa State University by our friend, Vance Crowe. I met Vance probably a little bit more than, let's say 1.5 years ago. Vance is a prominent speaker, speaks to agricultural audiences. He's a podcaster, communications expert that worked for a period of time for Monsanto in PR. Anyway, a very interesting person. Hails from St. Louis. We were pleased to have him up here in Ames. He's had some influence on Bitcoin. He was the gentleman, Cale, who first suggested that I build a node and install Bitcoin software.
Yeah, full circle moment.
Yeah, so it really was. So his talk to a mixed audience of Iowa State University students, another agriculturalist and Bitcoin enthusiast, was entitled "Bitcoin Will Demonetize Agricultural Land: How Young People Can Own Farmland in the Future." So, Cale, what were some of the highlights of the talk from your perspective?
Well, first of all, I agree. He's definitely a communications expert. I really enjoy that he has made the transition from the Sith to the Jedi, if you put it in Star Wars terms. He's doing, good work now. He clearly very much cares about the agriculture community. That stood out to me immediately in his ability to social engineer for the light side now. And then really big off the bat, I thought it was interesting. You start out with steel manning, which is great for a debate when you're talking to young people and really get them to look hard at Bitcoin. I thought it was very significant that, he asked these questions. How many of you college students, know about Bitcoin? 90%, 95% of the hands go up. How many own? 30%, which I think is very high given adoption rates.
It is. Huh.
Yeah. And then I think I would say 20% said they had a good idea of how Bitcoin actually works, which is interesting. And then he goes into, banking, fractional reserve banking, what's going on in the world, how Bitcoin works to a very deep level, which is always good. And then, gets to monetary premiums, which struck me the most because, as you know, I think the S&P, real estate, stuff like that is really high and will come down, like Fan said, when Bitcoin is understood.
Yeah, he made a really good point that when fiat money's value drips away, it's everybody's incentive to put it into something else. And that something else, from a young person's perspective, could represent housing. And it is really hard for somebody in the early stage of their career today to afford that. Or the audience that was there were people that plan to or aspire to farm. And farmland, same category of asset that is just really difficult for a young person to understand how they would ever own a significant amount of it.
Yeah. As a young person myself, being there with all the fellow college students, I enjoyed that it flipped on its head at the end. I think people were feeling the anxiety of the economic consequences, but then, he kind of flips it to, well, you have an opportunity as a young person to use Bitcoin to your advantage. Currently, the economy is working against you. And with Bitcoin, you might be able to buy your way back into getting some ground.
And for those that have heard me talk about Bitcoin, I have used the metaphor of Bitcoin as digital gold.
Yeah.
What did Vance have to say about that, Cale?
He said, absolutely not. It is farmland. But that's cool too, because it comes back to our friend Zach Smith and 21 million acres, which is a cool analogy.
Yeah. And from a supply perspective, we're not making any more farmland. Matter of fact, we're losing it. Yeah, probably is a better metaphor. So I'm going to have to adjust my metaphors in my talks.
Yeah, good, perfect for Bitcoin too. Let's just keep rolling with farmland.
Anyway, whether you are an experienced Bitcoin person or brand new to it, Vance is an exceptionally talented speaker, and we think you will very much enjoy this talk. We did, so enjoy.
Well, I'd love to say that I'm excited to be here, But I have to say that the first time I came to Iowa State University, it was an absolute catastrophe of epic proportions. And so I'm actually a little nervous to be here. And when we get done with the presentation, if you want to hear a funny story, I'll tell you about why my visit to Iowa State was so rough. But to begin tonight, I am going to give a talk on Bitcoin. And what I actually think is its opportunity to transform really the entire world, but especially your lives. I think that Bitcoin is an opportunity for everyone in this room, a young person that looks around and says, the world is getting faster and faster. Things seem to get harder and harder. Where am I going to fit in? And because you have decided to spend the most valuable thing that you have, your attention, on tonight, coming and hearing a lecture, whether you're here for extra credit or if you're here because of your own interests, what I hope to do is to make this spend of the most precious thing you have, your attention, valuable to everyone. And even if you're not interested in Bitcoin, I'd like to introduce some kind of philosophical concepts that I think, no matter what, will help you throughout the rest of your life. And I'm gonna do that, but I thought maybe I would give just a little bit of my background. I came from small town central Illinois. I decided the only thing I wanted to do was get away from that small town, so I went away to school in Milwaukee. I did a bunch of things. I became a deckhand on a small ecotourism ship. I renovated a house. I joined the U.S. Peace Corps and lived in Kenya. I ended up working at a public radio station in Northern California while me and my buddies were restoring an old ship. I went on to get a graduate degree in negotiations and went to work at the World Bank, and then ultimately moved to St. Louis and took a job as the director of millennial engagement for Monsanto, which is kind of an awkward way of saying, you know how there are people that have strong feelings about GMOs and pesticides? My job was to go talk to those people. And in doing this, I had to deeply understand, how do you connect with people? Because it's not enough for you to have the things that you think are the right answers and try and argue with other people. That doesn't really change their minds. You have to find another way to be able to engage with people's arguments, because the truth of the matter is, no matter how much you know about something, you could be wrong. There could be aspects of what you believe, what you've been taught, what the world already knows that could be wrong. And so that's why I want to talk about the first concept of steel manning. And if you take nothing away from the Bitcoin perspective of my talk tonight, I want you to really understand this concept, steel manning. Steel manning is a term invented by a guy named Michael Vassar, who was a part of the rationalist community. These are people that are highly logical and they love getting together and arguing with one another. And they realized that there was a tendency for people to do what is called straw manning. That's where you take a person's argument and you kind of make it up. So you're saying, and then you give a faulty argument, and then you chop away at that not great argument. Well, steel manning is the opposite of that. Steel manning is the process of listening to another person, hearing their point of view, no matter how different it is from what you think. And instead of going towards your base instinct of finding why it's wrong, you first ask yourself, do I know enough about this subject to make the other person's argument better? Now, this is a wonderful technique because it keeps us humble. It keeps us really focusing on, do I really understand something, or am I defending my tribal beliefs? Am I defending all the things that I thought I knew? So I want to start off with this because what I am going to propose today, I think, will shock many of you. And that's okay. And in fact, I am perfectly delighted. In fact, I hope we find some places where you're pointing out things that I'm not considering and not thinking about. But what I would really hope that we could do, and one of the things that I learned by being the director of millennial engagement, was that it is far more valuable for everyone here who's focusing their attention on this topic to, instead of just saying, that's wrong, that's dumb, I don't agree with that, or what about this? You first seek to say, can I know enough about this that I can improve his argument? And if you can, then bring the challenges. The other topic or the other concept that I want to introduce is what I call the dissent paradox. The dissent paradox is something I ask people on my podcast, where I say, what is one thing that you believe that almost no one you know agrees with you on? Now, the reason this is such a challenging question is because most of what we think, somebody told us. We just kind of absorbed it from what people like me think like. And that's okay. That's a normative thing. And in fact, we as human beings evolved not to look for the right answer, but to look for the answer that allows us to be in the tribe. Because to have an answer back in the days when we were hunters and gatherers that was right was actually less valuable than having opinions that allowed you to be a part of the group. So this asks you, is there anything that I know or that I believe that is different than what everybody else thinks? And the reason this is a paradox, and I ask this on my podcast, is because it's a very difficult question to answer. First, hard to come up with this dissent paradox. What's something I believe that nobody else does? But it's even harder because as soon as you say it, now you're in the position where you have to think, how am I going to explain this so that when I walk away, people are convinced by my argument? Now, I bring this up because I ask this question all the time on my podcast. And I do it because it shakes people up, right? Instead of having just an ordinary podcast where people are saying their ordinary things, now all of a sudden they have to put themselves in the position. Most of the time, you know what people say? Nah, I don't know. Or they say some answer that's really not that deep. But every once in a while, you find somebody that thinks something that you don't agree with at all. And now you have discovered an entire field, a huge open space where you can start to discover something that you didn't know. Now, the funny thing about this is that my my dissent paradox is that Bitcoin is going to entirely demonetize ag. And I've said this on my podcast, which, and if any of you are podcasters or people that put stuff out on social media, you never really take yourself that serious. You're just like, I'm just a guy talking into a microphone. Well, now I'm standing up at Iowa State at the ag school talking about my dissent paradox. Now, how many in this room agree with this concept? Okay, well, there are a couple, and I happen to know all of them, and so that doesn't count. But I'm going to try and approach this dissent paradox, and hopefully by the end, you don't necessarily agree with me, but that by the time we get to the end, you are capable of engaging in a conversation because you know enough about the topic that you can meaningfully add to it. So what we're going to cover today is how Bitcoin works, just in general. And just as a show of hands, how many of you feel like you have a general understanding of Bitcoin? Okay, that's really good. How many of you feel like you have a strong understanding of Bitcoin? You know how to buy it, you know how to move it, you know how to... All right, and how many of you have run a node? Okay, so we've got a good mix in here. I'm excited that there are some people that actually really know about it, because once you set up a node, the game is totally changed, in my opinion. We aren't going to talk about that today, but if you want to get into it, we can. Then I'm going to talk about, like, how do you actually own a Bitcoin, right? What do you mean, own a Bitcoin? How does that work? Then I'm going to talk about something that maybe seems obvious. What is money? It seems like I know what money is. It's the thing in my pocket. It's the thing I spend. It's the thing I get for working. But let's go a little bit deeper and let's talk about what actually is money. And then we're going to talk about preserving value. And what I mean by this is I believe that our dollars are losing value so much faster than we can keep up that we are all falling behind. And this is the reason why Bitcoin is so important. And then finally, I'm going to get to why I believe Bitcoin is going to demonetize agriculture and really farmland. Okay, how Bitcoin works. For those of you that know a lot about Bitcoin, this is going to be a super simple primer for you. But to begin with, Bitcoin, there will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin. Now, why it's 21 million and exactly how that works, that goes into the details. But it's important to start off with this concept. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin. There are very, very few things in this world that we can say there will only ever be this amount of that thing. And this becomes very important later in the conversation. But to begin with, 21 million. Each Bitcoin can be broken into Satoshis. Satoshis are the equivalent of a penny. A penny is $0.01. Well, a Bitcoin can be broken into 100,000, or I'm sorry, 100 million Satoshis. So 0.0000001 Bitcoin is the smallest denomination that you can have of a Bitcoin. So when people say, I'm going to go out and buy Bitcoin, sometimes they can be confused by this idea. Oh, I have to go out and buy a whole Bitcoin. Well, right now they're priced at $67,000, and you might think that's out of reach. But the truth is, you can actually go and buy any amount of Bitcoin, a very, very small amount of Bitcoin, and it will just show up as Satoshis. As I said, 100 million Satoshis equals 1 Bitcoin. Now let's talk about the innovation of Bitcoin. Why is this such a fascinating and truly breathtaking technology when you understand it? We're going to start off by talking about digital photographs, right? A digital photograph is an innovation that happened in my lifetime. When I was younger, there were no digital photographs, and now that's pretty much the only way you get photographs, right? One of the reasons why a digital photograph is so great is that you can take it and you can make 100 copies of it, and it costs you nothing. And it can be sent anywhere in the world instantly. You just pull out your phone, send it in a text, send it in an email, put it up on social media. This is amazing. So you have this digital asset that can be infinitely copied and sent anywhere in the world. And in fact, this is true of almost everything that's digital, right? Anything that is digital can be copied incredibly easily, right? That's why if you were making digital art, there's no way to truly preserve it, because as soon as somebody gets a copy of that digital art, they can make copies of it, right? This is why Bitcoin is truly different. Because yes, Bitcoin can be sent anywhere in the world instantly, just like that photograph. But the thing you can't do is replicate a Bitcoin. This is what is known as digital scarcity. This is the true wonder of the world. And in fact, I would put it on par with things like the Great Wall of China, the pyramids, the printing press. For the first time in all of human existence, in particular in the modern age, since we developed digital things, we now have a digital object that cannot be duplicated. So you get the benefit of having that digital thing, that digital money, and but it can't be copied. You can't just say, "Oh, you have a little bit of Bitcoin. I'm going to take your Bitcoin and I'm going to make a copy of it." That doesn't happen. This may not seem like a big deal, but it actually completely upends the entire system that we've had up till this point, which is we kind of intuitively think that we already have digital money. We have credit cards, right? Or we have Venmo. So if I want to send money from me to you, then I can put it into Venmo and it goes from me to you and it's done, right? But this is not actually how that works. The way that all of this works is if you want to send money digitally, you have to pay a middleman. And that middleman, like a credit card company, they look at how much trust do we have in him, which is the credit score that you have, and how much money will we front give somebody else and then wait up to 90 days for that to clear. We don't often know that, but it actually takes more than 90 days for the merchant who is accepting a credit card, the store for a sandwich or for whatever, from when you run that credit card to when money actually moves from you to them, it takes 90 days. Bitcoin, it takes 10 minutes. Also, in order to make that transaction happen, there's a middleman there. There's Visa, there's MasterCard, American Express. And so these people that are offering you this credit, why they're offering you that is because they're taking an analog asset, dollars, they're converting it into something digital, and then they are shipping it to somebody else. But there's not really a conversion. It's just on a spreadsheet. And then you get the money. And what they charge for that is 2.9% of every single transaction that ever happens. It is a hidden tax on every single expense that we have, and it has gone on for so long that it's like a fish in water. We don't even think about it. We don't even know anything about it. But why you get frequent flyer miles or cash back, that's because they're trying to induce you, hey, use our credit card, because that merchant, the person that's accepting that money, he's giving us 2.9% of every single thing that he makes if you pay with a credit card. And so Bitcoin goes around this. With Bitcoin, you are not going to a middleman. Instead, what you are doing is you have Bitcoin, you submit it to a node, you say, I want to send money from me to you, and there's nobody that gets in between there. And there's a small fee that happens for the transaction, the way that the system is set up, but it's like 1 Satoshi, and you could be sending hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of money. It could be a very, very small amount on those fees. So how do you own a Bitcoin? What does that mean to own a Bitcoin? Well, first, you guys are probably familiar with exchanges. There's things like Robinhood, there's River, there's Strike. These maybe are names that you guys are familiar with. You go to one of these sites and you hook up your credit card or your bank account and you move money into an exchange and you say, hey, I want to buy $100 worth of Bitcoin or $5 worth of Bitcoin. They then go out into the market, whatever the price is at that moment, they go out and buy it for you and they put it into your exchange. Now, when it's sitting on an exchange, it's not really your Bitcoin. I mean, maybe legally speaking, it's your Bitcoin, but if that exchange breaks down, if it turns out that exchange, like was it FTX, right? They were doing all these games with other people's money, and it turned out they didn't have all the money and they didn't have all the Bitcoin. So if you leave your Bitcoin on an exchange, you don't actually own it. You own it when you move that Bitcoin from an exchange to a wallet. Now, what is a wallet? Well, a wallet is really similar to an email address, right? You've got your public email address, and that is where people can send you money. That's what that code is up there. And then you have what's called a private key. And the private key is your password to get to the money that's on that wallet. So an example of a wallet might be a Trezor, there's cold cards, there's these physical devices. Now, what's funny is when you first get into Bitcoin, you think, oh, my Bitcoin is in that wallet. It's in that little electronic device. And if I lose that electronic device, I'm in big trouble. I've lost all my Bitcoin. We've heard about people losing their Bitcoin. But that's not actually true. That electronic device that's over there actually holds what are called your seed phrase. Your seed phrase is that password we were talking about, the one that allows you to get access to your Bitcoin. So some people use 12 words, some people use 24 words, but those 24 words put in the exact right order make it incredibly difficult to hack. And if you lose the electronic device, or it breaks, it gets flooded, or there's a fire, it doesn't matter. As long as you remember the 12 or the 24 words, even if you don't have them written down, they're just in your head, you now can move that Bitcoin. And how do you know if you own a Bitcoin? You know you own a Bitcoin if you have the power to move it, which is why if your Bitcoin is sitting on an exchange, you don't actually own it. Now, this may seem like, why am I learning all this? Where is this going? But these are the fundamentals that you need to know in order to be able to kind of understand the deeper picture. We lost that screen over there. So if you want to send Bitcoin, you have a public address we talked about. Then if you want to move that, you would find out what's somebody else's address. You input your private key, and the transaction is added to the blockchain. You guys have heard this term, blockchain? The blockchain is just a record of every single Bitcoin and every single time it's moved from one wallet to another. Now, this is kind of a neat thing because the blockchain is what's secure. It's not just kind of a neat thing. It is a true innovation. And the only place that I know that a blockchain actually matters, even though people talk about, I'm going to build this kind of blockchain, or I'm going to build a blockchain over here. The reason the blockchain matters in Bitcoin is that it is a record of every single transaction that's ever happened, and no one can change that blockchain. It's impossible to go back a week, a month, 5 years, and change one of those transactions that's happened on there. There's no middleman, and all of this is done through the computerized system. So that is a super high level introduction to Bitcoin. How many people in here learned something from that they didn't know, they'd never heard before? All right, great. So now what I want to do, now that we kind of have this general primer of an understanding and of what Bitcoin is, we're going to park that for a second. And I want to talk about what is money, right? And of course, since I've already kind of poked at money is more than just what's in your pocket, I want to talk a little bit more theoretical. So we think of money as like, this is what it gives me the ability to buy something, to sell something. I have this money. But why did we ever invent it? Well, we invented it because when we were first in small groups in a tribe, or there were multiple tribes around, we could trade. You have eggs and I have some kind of basket that you can use, and I need eggs. So we exchange these goods. Now, this is all works very well when you have a very small group and you have a limited number of things that people can produce. But as groups of people grow, as you move from just tribes to now having civilization, now you have this problem of what is known as the double coincidence of wants. And this is where, what happens if you have eggs that I want, but I don't have anything that you want? Because the only way you and I can make a trade is if we both coincidentally want the thing that the other person has. So now, if you want to grow your community bigger than just what is barterable, now you have to come up with a way to represent the value of things that you've created. So, for example, now if I only have oranges, this is what I'm really good at, is producing oranges. If I can't find another person that has something that I want that also wants oranges, I can now go take oranges in exchange for money. But what is money? What does this mean that you would exchange it for money? Well, money is just a marker that says how much of your attention has gone into something. Money is the stored value of your attention. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you're a farmer and you're going out and you're trying to produce a crop, you've had to spend time and energy to learn how to farm. You have to have the land. You have to have the equipment. All of these things are your attention. And the more attention you put into something, if other people want that thing, the more value you are creating. So money is really a representation of how much attention and how valuable that attention was. But you see, there's a funny thing that happens, right? How do you create a money that can't be replicated, right? We all have heard those stories about the Native Americans in Manhattan that traded away their island for a bunch of glass beads. And now we laugh at that. How could they be so silly? But think about their time. Back then, when they first started getting these glass beads, this was something that they knew nobody in their tribe or anyone else that they knew that they were spending all of their history with could produce. And so they were getting this thing, there was very few of them, and they could now say, 3 hours of work on making a basket, that's worth one glass bead. And so now they can have this sense of there's a finite thing, glass beads, and I can associate that with what I produce. And now if I have those glass beads, if I can't find somebody that wants the thing that I have, maybe they want glass beads so that they can go take those and buy something that they want. But the real challenge of human civilization is when you develop money, how can you keep it from somebody hijacking the system? Because what the people on Manhattan Island didn't know was that the people in England that were producing these glass beads had already gone through a form of industrial revolution. They could produce glass beads ad nauseum. They were worthless to them. And so these people were trading for what they thought was a very, very scarce thing, glass beads, only glass beads kept being pumped into the system. So now what used to be able to be purchased by one glass bead or 3 glass beads, now 3 glass beads doesn't buy you anything. You've got to have 10 glass beads, then 100, then many more. These people were not making a foolish mistake because they were so enamored by glass beads. They just didn't understand that people could hijack that system. Now, this is a problem that has actually been something that has plagued human beings since the dawn of civilization, since we started having money. Because almost anything that you use to represent the value of your time and attention can be replicated. It used to be people would weigh in the Midwest, they would use shells, right? And so now, because there weren't very many shells, they weren't living near an ocean. Well, as soon as somebody figures out, wait, if I just make a trip back to North Carolina, I can go pick up these shells off the ground, and then I can go back and I'll be rich. Now you think, well, the way we could solve this, really simple. We'll just use something that's finite, gold, right? People believe, oh, gold will be this thing because there's not very much of it, right? This is kind of what we think. We've heard of the gold standard. But gold has a few problems as well. And this is the best solution that we had for a very long time. Gold is difficult to mine. You have to go put work and effort into doing it. And when people would take gold, you first, when you get a hunk of a rock that's shiny, you don't actually know if it's gold. The only way you can know if it's gold is if you melt it down. So the solution that people came up with to get around this, so everybody didn't have to melt down the gold every time they were given some, is they started doing coinage, right? A group of people that were in charge, the government, would take that gold and they would put a stamp on it that would be very difficult to replicate. Maybe make ridges on it, put a person's face on it, right? But the problem is that, one, if you have gold, it's really soft. Do you know what you can do with it? You can start cutting off the edges of those coins. And if you cut off enough edges over a long enough time, you can start lowering the value of the coins that are out there and creating your own. The other challenge of gold, one that people don't really think about, it actually stunned me when I thought about this, is gold is actually being produced at about a rate of 2 to 2.5% every year. We are adding more gold all the time. And when the price of gold goes way up, like it has, what's going to happen? Investors, capitalists are going to say, whoa, now we can make an investment into more shovels, more trucks, more mining equipment, and let's go get more gold out of the ground. And so gold itself is not finite. It's the closest that we have, and that's why it was used for so long. But gold's drawback, you have to melt it down. If you want to move it, it's heavy. You've got to be able to find a way to move it from point A to point B without somebody robbing you. So Bitcoin is an answer to one of the challenges, or to the many challenges of money that people have had. Now, you could say, well, we have the US dollar, and this has been very good. This is very stable. And in fact, we are the most stable currency in the world by far. But the government figured out, once they got off the gold standard, that if you don't have to have gold backing up your dollars, now you can print as many dollars as you want. And this is, at first, something that makes the people really, really happy. Because what you used to have to do, if you say, hey, the people have voted me into office so that I can make these roads and I can offer these social programs, right? But they don't want to be taxed. Well, we won't tax them. what we'll do is we'll print more money. We'll go to the bank, just like in Monopoly, and we'll just drop $500 bills all the way around. But what happens when you add more money in Monopoly to the prices of all the properties? It goes up. The US government has been printing money at an astonishing rate. And this is the graph of how much they've been putting into circulation over time. We could talk about the staggering numbers and how much more the dollars have been printed. Just in the last 5 years, we've essentially doubled the amount of circulation of US dollars, which means that the value of your attention, just like those people that lost value with their glass beads, goes down rapidly. But this is actually not the whole story, because it isn't just how many dollars the US puts into circulation, but we also live in a world that uses what's called fractional reserve banking. Does anybody in here know what that is? A few people. This might blow your minds, because when a bank takes a deposit from somebody, so the way a bank makes money is they take in deposits from people and they say, don't worry about storing all this money under your mattress. You can give it to us. We've got a big vault. We've got guards. We can keep it safe. And what we're going to do with that money is, if you give us a deposit, you can use your checking account. You can use a savings account. Whenever you want it, you can come get it. But while you've got it stored here, we're going to lend some of it out, so that way somebody that wants to buy a house or wants to start a factory, they can borrow that money from us, and we can put it to work. And that's how it used to be, that they paid interest rates on savings accounts. They don't really pay very much on savings accounts now, but that's for a whole nother reason. So the interesting thing about this fractional reserve banking is, let's say you deposit $100 into my bank. I take 90 of those dollars and loan them out to you. But you don't need all 90 of those dollars right now. So you put that money back into the bank until you need it. And then I take those $90 and I loan out 90% of them. I loan out whatever that is, $72, right, to you. And you put the money that you're not using right now into the bank. And so now I have $72 and I can loan out 90% of it. So now we're talking about $62, right, that I can loan out. So now this one person, you think you have $100, you think you have $90, you think you have $60, right? And all of this is money that is created. It doesn't actually exist. It's called M2 money. And M2 money is actually the wildly bigger part of the amount of money in circulation. It's because banks loan it out over and over and over again. And you might think, well, there must be regulations on this. This must be something that we control for. But it turns out the Federal Reserve, the laws on the books are, you do not actually have to have any capital reserves. You can loan out all the money all the way down to zero. Now, there are some laws about capital controls and certain things where they have to keep a certain amount of base money. But if everybody went to go get their money out of the bank right now, there would be at least 9 times more demands on those dollars than there are dollars in the banks. This has created a very fragile system. And it also means every time the government loans out or prints money, there is a huge, bigger amount of money that's coming into the system because of the M2 money. So, as you're hearing this, you have to be wondering, wait a second, am I accepting glass beads for my work? Is this all going to get inflated away so that what I can purchase is now worth far with what I can purchase from the work that I did today is going to go down? And the answer is yes. One of the interesting calculations is $100 in 1900 has the same purchasing power as about $3,800 has today. That's how much our value of our money has gone down. Because over the last over 120 years, it's had a massive amount. In fact, it's worth about 3% of what it was worth 100 years ago. So what can you do to preserve your money? you make this money, you work really hard, you can go out and make investments. You can say, oh, I want to buy this stock, or I want to buy this business, or I'm going to invest in something that people say that we're going to give you more money back than what you gave us. The challenge with an investment is you are taking a risk. Most businesses don't succeed. Most opportunities don't play out. If you were betting on the regular stock market, right now there are very, very few profitable companies. The only thing that's really holding it up are the magnificent seven, right? Many of the other companies aren't making any money at all. And yet, what are you going to do with your money if you don't do an investment? Are you going to put it in a savings account? Well, no, because if you put $1,000 in a savings account, a year later, the amount you can buy with that $1,000 is less. And so investments have big drawbacks. And this is why there are things called a monetary premium. This is where there are certain things that we buy, not because of their utility value necessarily, but because we believe that they will hold their value, right? They will be worth more in the future. So an obvious one, gold, even in its raw form, right? That's something people buy because they think, hey, it's not going to lose its value that quickly. So there is a certain amount of the price of gold is what's called a monetary premium. It's what people believe this is going to hold the value of my money, so I'm going to buy it. Another one, a house, right? We know that the boomers, right? This is one of the big complaints people have about the boomers. They bought a house for $30,000 and today it's worth, $1.2 million. And it's not something you can jump in on, right? But they rode that monetary premium up as more and more people knew, hey, I can't leave my money in my bank account because it's going to get hurt to inflation, and I don't have any investments I want to make, so I'm going to put it into my house. Another, that's a Rothko painting. It was worth $47 million, right? If you've ever wondered, why is it that art has such a high price on it? It's because oftentimes the art people are buying is very unique. There's only one, or maybe 4 or 5. And so people buy art hoping that this will be a way to preserve their value. They're not keeping it in glass beads. They're trying to put it into something that they think people will need in the future. You can see monetary premiums in things like wine and jewelry. And certainly you can see it in ag land. We know that people go out and they say, I want to make sure to hold the value of my money, so I am going to go out and buy farmland because it always goes up in price. And so this has some downstream consequences that we're going to talk about in a little bit. But one of the major places where people store the value of their dollars so that way they can retrieve them someday in the future is in ag land. So why do I think that ag will demonetize farmland? Well, it's probably good for me to talk about what does it mean, demonetize? Well, I talked about that monetary premium. I believe, that should say, why will Bitcoin demonetize ag land? But I believe that Bitcoin is going to have the power to suck the monetary premium out of all sorts of things that people are right now putting into these objects because they're trying to pass up the gold bead problem. Now, first, remember I had said that that gold was probably the best answer that we had to the money problem, right? Of how can you keep people from going and getting more shells or beads or clipping off the corners. And so sometimes people will call Bitcoin digital gold. But I actually think this is not a good comparison. Because as I said before, if the price of gold goes up, people go out and dig deeper and deeper holes and they go get more gold. And so gold is actually inflating. I think that the better analogy to Bitcoin is farmland. Because farmland is the one thing that you can't make more of. You can't make more farm ground. This is why people invest in it as a monetary premium. They put their money there to hold its value because they know there are only 380 some odd million acres of farmland in the United States, and every year we don't go get more. In fact, 2.5 million acres every year are taken out. And so they look at that supply and demand and they say, it's better to have my money in farmland than it is to keep it in my bank account or maybe even in the stock market. This is scarcity, and that's why I actually like to compare Bitcoin to ag land, because it's a much better analogy than it is to gold. But I believe that Bitcoin is coming for the monetary premium of everything. And this is where I'm going to step away from my slides and we'll just start to have a conversation. The reason that I believe this is because of that first thing we talked about. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin. Right now, there are 20 million Bitcoin in the system. And every 10 minutes, 3.25 Bitcoin are put into the system. And that's going to run for the next 2 years. And then that amount that is distributed every 10 minutes is going to go down by half. So it'll be like 1.7 some Bitcoin every 10 minutes. And then as that goes for another 4 years, then it's going to get cut in half, where less than a Bitcoin is put out every 10 minutes. And so while gold is continuing to go up in the amount people are producing, Bitcoin is actually going down. And what this is going to mean is that when people begin to realize, wait a second, there is a scarce asset that no one can steal from me, because if I hold those 12 or 24 words, I can go anywhere in the world I want. I don't have to carry it with me. I don't even have to hold the cards or anything about it on me. I can just keep those words in my mind. So I can have this asset where I can send value anywhere in the world, anytime that I want, to anyone that I want. I can take it anywhere, and nobody can get in between me sending my Bitcoin to you if I have your address. And as we saw during, I don't know if you guys watched the Canadian trucker rallies or different experiences when people were trying to send money and the government didn't want them to, they just shut the system off. Well, Bitcoin's totally different. You can't shut it off. It's a decentralized system. So if you have a node, which we talked about earlier a little bit, there's no one that can get in between you sending Bitcoin from you to another person. So with all of these things, I believe that people will wake up. Now, Iowa is largely owned by people that farm the land. Not entirely. You have a lot of landlords, absent landlords that own the land and then have other people farm it. But many places throughout the country have a huge amount of landlords that own the land. They are just holding it because they want it to preserve their value, and they are willing to keep buying, not because they're going to be able to produce more or produce more efficiently, or even that they want to farm it at all. The reason they're buying it is to preserve that value that we were talking about. And so when they begin to realize, wait a second, if I can purchase a thing that is finite like land, but I don't have to worry about who farms it, I don't have to worry about the insurance, I don't have to worry about property tax and paying that all of the time, I am going to realize, the people are going to realize that the value that you get back from owning Bitcoin far exceeds the amount that you can get from land. And ultimately, we all know that land is priced right now way beyond what's known as its utility value. What I mean by that is your land should be somewhere around how much can it produce, maybe over a certain amount of time. So, but land prices are way beyond what you can produce on that land. In fact, that's why it's so hard for new people that don't have assets or equipment or any of these things to get into farming, because the price of that land is up way higher than it needs to be because people are trying to preserve that value. So ordinarily with an older audience, they hear that Bitcoin's going to demonetize land and it frightens them because it says, hey, the total value of the assets that I own are going to be reduced so substantially. I don't like this. I don't want this. But if my hypothesis is correct, that when people that are running hedge funds realize, hey, Bitcoin has over the last 15 years had more than a 65% return year after year after year after year, me having my client in this farmland is actually a bad investment. We should be in this other place. And then you won't have to deal with property taxes and county governments and people that are renting out the land, which means the price of that land is going to go down. And this is a huge opportunity for young people like you who have watched for your entire lives and been told, if you haven't been handed a farm, you're not going to get to farm. But I believe that if instead of focusing on how can I go to a bank and get them to give me a loan or get somebody to sign for that loan so I can take on debt and now I owe somebody just for the pleasure of having money, if instead of you focusing your time and energy on how to do that, you are purchasing Bitcoin now in whatever level that you can, the value appreciation of that Bitcoin is going to deal you into the land game in a way that was never thought possible before. So that is my descent paradox. And I think you all have enough knowledge now to be able to engage in discussion about this. So what I'd like to do for the remainder of the time is invite you guys to come to the microphone, ask questions, say what you know, and we will all be better off if somebody has something to say about what I said and proves me wrong, then I'll be that much better for it. So let's steelman this idea together. Thank you.